I thought the worst thing about those 9 days was the loneliness. Lying flat in a hospital bed with tubes running into my arm and a fever that made the fluorescent lights above me ripple like the surface of a disturbed pool, I had convinced myself that the hardest part was simply this: surviving the surgery, surviving the sepsis, surviving the slow and grinding work of a body trying to repair itself from the inside out. I had no idea that while I was barely conscious, drifting in and out of a morphine haze in a ward on the 4th floor of St. Crispin's Medical Center, my husband Mark and his mother Eleanor were sitting at the kitchen table of the house my mother had left me, working their way through documents I had never agreed to sign. They told everyone they were rooting for me. They sent a flower arrangement to the nurses' station. Sunflowers and white lilies, cheerful and expensive, with a card that read, "Get well soon, our fighter." They posted a family photo on Mark's Facebook, the 3 of us from last Christmas, standing in the snow outside the house, all smiling, with a caption that read, "Sending every bit of our love to our brave Clara. We are rooting for you, Mom." 30 days after I came home, when I finally had enough strength to open a drawer in the home office that I had not touched since before the ambulance came, I found the document that told me precisely what they had been doing while I lay there alone in the dark, counting the ceiling tiles and waiting for someone to stay. The house on Merriweather Lane had been my mother's before it was mine. She bought it in 1998. A narrow 2-story with cream-painted wood siding and a wraparound porch that she spent every warm weekend filling with potted geraniums and mismatched outdoor furniture she rescued from yard sales and painted cheerful colors. There was an oak tree in the backyard that dropped acorns on the roof each autumn in a slow, irregular rhythm that I had fallen asleep to as a child. A sound so familiar it had become indistinguishable from silence. I knew every particular of that house the way you know things that have been part of you since before you had the language to name them. The kitchen linoleum with the small chip near the base of the refrigerator that my mother had covered with a strip of black electrical tape and never replaced. The bathroom window that required you to push the top left corner with the heel of your hand before it would unstick. The precise complaint of the 3rd stair from the bottom, a low wooden groan I had learned to step over as a teenager, sneaking in past curfew, placing my foot on the 4th stair instead and holding my breath. When my mother died 4 years ago, leaving the house to me alone in her will, with a simplicity that had the quality of a long decision finally delivered, I moved back in almost without thinking. It was grief and practicality in equal measure. Mark and I had been renting a 2-bedroom apartment across town, and the mortgage on Merriweather Lane was fully paid, and the house was there. And being inside, it felt like still being adjacent to her in some way. I was not ready to give up. I never put Mark's name on the deed. It was not a deliberate act of separation. It was simply that the house had been mine before he was mine, a fact that felt as natural and unremarkable as my own last name. And in the early years of our marriage, neither of us had thought to question it, except once. About 18 months after we moved in, Mark had mentioned, in that offhand way of his that was never quite as offhand as it sounded, that it might make sense from a legal standpoint to put the property in both names. Simplicity, he said, in case anything happened. I had said I would think about it. He had not pressed the issue. But I remembered the particular quality of his pause before he let it go. The way his jaw had tightened briefly and then relaxed, as if filing the conversation away rather than abandoning it entirely. Eleanor had never said outright that the house should be in both names. She was far too measured for that kind of directness. What she said instead were things like, "It must feel so grounding to have a real home, Clara. Not everyone is that fortunate," in a tone that managed to be simultaneously warm and pointed, like a thumbtack pressed into velvet. She was a small woman, compact, precise, always dressed in muted colors, dusty rose and pale beige, and the occasional soft gray, with a silver bob she had worn the same way for as long as I had known her. Her hands were always still, folded in her lap or wrapped around a coffee cup, never gesturing, never fidgeting, and there was something in that stillness that I had always found faintly unsettling without being able to name why. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was listening, as if she were calibrating rather than paying attention, and her smile was efficient. It arrived quickly and left quickly, and rarely made the full journey to her pale gray-green eyes, which could look either warm or cold depending on the light, or perhaps depending on her mood, or perhaps, I would later understand, depending on what she wanted you to see. I had spent 6 years learning to coexist with her particular brand of quiet control. The way she rearranged the items on my kitchen counter when she came to visit, always with some perfectly reasonable explanation about flow or accessibility. The way she asked questions about my income or my savings under the pretense of concern. The way she made suggestions about my own home with such gentle certainty that resisting them felt like irrational stubbornness. Mark called her a handful and laughed his easy laugh, and I called her a handful to my best friend Jess and did not laugh at all. And for 6 years, the three of us maintained a carefully managed truce that none of us ever named as such. I was making dinner when the pain started. A Wednesday in mid-October, just past 6 in the evening. The light through the kitchen window, that particular amber that only October can produce, warm and faintly mournful at the same time, and the kitchen full of the smell of garlic softening and olive oil, the comfortable evening sizzle of a weeknight meal. The pain arrived in my lower right side without warning, sharp and specific and wrong in a way I recognized immediately as something other than the usual, not cramping, not the pull of tired muscles, but something deeper and more insistent, something that had the quality of an alarm going off in a room I did not know existed. By 8, I was on the bathroom floor with my forehead against the cool ceramic of the tub, and by 9, Mark was driving me to the emergency room with one arm on the wheel and one hand scrolling his phone, and I was too nauseated and frightened to ask who he was texting. The appendix had not merely inflamed, it had ruptured, the surgeon told Mark in the hallway while I was surfacing from anesthesia, and the infection had spread in the hours between the onset of pain and the surgery, and I would need to stay. What was expected to be an overnight observation became 2 nights, then 4, then a full 9 days of IV antibiotics and fever management and the grinding, exhausting work of recovery. 9 days of fluorescent light and the particular smell of hospital corridors, antiseptic and floor wax and the faint metallic undertone that never quite goes away, and the sounds of the ward at night, the steady rhythm of the monitors, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the low, hushed exchanges from the nurse's station, the occasional muffled cry from somewhere down the hall, and waiting, always in between the waiting. Mark came on the first day for 2 hours. He brought a plastic container of soup from the deli on Clement Street, chicken noodle, my usual order, that I was not allowed to eat on account of the post-surgical restrictions, and he sat in the chair beside my bed and held my hand for approximately 10 minutes before he checked his phone, and then checked it again, and then asked the attending nurse twice whether I was going to be fine and whether there was a timeline for discharge. When she offered a vague optimism about the antibiotics, his shoulders came down from around his ears in a visible release of tension, and he stayed another 40 minutes and then kissed my forehead and said he would be back tomorrow. He came on day 3, briefly, and day 5, and day 7. He texted regularly, short, warm messages that said things like, "Thinking of you and the house misses you and get some rest. I've got everything handled." And I read them in the blue light of my phone in the small hours of the morning when the ward was quietest and loneliest. And I held on to them the way you hold on to anything solid when you are frightened and far from home. Eleanor came once. Day 2, mid-afternoon, when I was propped against pillows and still foggy from the previous evening's morphine dose, the pain held at a manageable distance, but the world still slightly tilted and soft-edged. She sat at the foot of my bed with her hands folded in her lap and her head at that slight leftward tilt, and she brought me white carnations in a plastic sleeve that she set on the windowsill without finding a vase for them. She asked how I was feeling in a way that did not quite wait for the answer before moving to the next question. She asked whether I had anyone checking on the house while I was away. She asked whether Mark had his key. She asked where I kept my important papers, the house documents, the insurance, the deed. I was tired and medicated, and her voice had that particular quality of soft, steady competence that made it easy to answer without thinking. I told her the filing cabinet. I said the home office, the bottom drawer, a pale green folder. She nodded slowly as if I had confirmed something she already suspected. Then she patted my foot through the blanket, once, a single firm pat, and smiled with her mouth. "Don't worry about a thing," she said. "We've got everything handled." I closed my eyes and let myself believe her, because I needed to believe her, because the alternative required an energy I simply did not have. On the 4th night, a nurse named Diane came to check my vitals. A broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped natural hair and the specific unhurried warmth of someone who has spent years at the center of other people's emergencies and learned to remain level within them. She noted something on my chart and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that the ward had received a call that afternoon from a number asking whether I was lucid enough to sign paperwork. The call had come in as a general inquiry and had been transferred to the charge nurse, who had told them that visiting was restricted and that I was currently on pain management. Diane told me this the way you relay something that might be nothing and might be something. Carefully, without emphasis, watching my face. "Your husband," she said, "and an older woman. They called together on the same number." I said that was strange. I said I was sure it was nothing. She made a note and moved on, and I lay in the dark after she left and turned it over in my mind until the painkillers pulled me back down into something that was not quite sleep. The next morning, Mark texted, "Eleanor sends her love. We're rooting for you." I stared at the words for a long time before I answered. I came home on a Tuesday, 11 days after the night I had been standing at the stove watching the garlic soften. Mark collected me with a clean blanket folded on the passenger seat and a travel mug of tea in the cup holder, and when he helped me through the front door, Eleanor was already in my kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter, with the proprietary ease of someone entirely at home, and the smell of something slow-cooked and savory filled the whole downstairs. The house was clean, more thoroughly clean than it ever was when Mark managed it alone. Every surface wiped and ordered, the papers from my desk stacked carefully in the corner of the home office. It looked, I noticed briefly, like a house that had been gone through. I translated this thought immediately into gratitude. They had cleaned for me, they had prepared, They were being kind. Eleanor served the food with her quiet efficiency, and Mark sat across from me and smiled, and I ate slowly and went to bed before 8 and fell asleep to the sound of the oak tree and the particular creak of the house settling around me, and told myself, I am home. I am safe. I will be fine. For 30 days, I concentrated on getting well. I rested and ate carefully and walked small loops around the backyard in the mornings when the air was cold and the bare branches of the oak tree stood against a white November sky. I slept in the afternoons. I let Mark bring me tea and Eleanor bring casseroles, and let myself be grateful for the care without looking too closely at what sat underneath it. There were small moments I noticed and set aside. A phone Mark angled away from me when I came into a room, a conversation that paused a beat too long when I appeared in a doorway, a look that passed between him and Eleanor one afternoon when I mentioned needing to call the insurance company about the hospital billing, quick and sideways and gone almost before I could name it. I was not yet strong enough to follow those moments where they led. I made a quiet internal agreement with myself. Later, when I am stronger. Later. It was the insurance paperwork that led me there in the end. A Wednesday in mid-November, the same amber afternoon light angling through the home office window, and I was looking for the policy documents, a pale green folder in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, labeled House and Insurance in my own handwriting. The drawer stuck, the way it did in damp weather, and when I worked it open, the pale green folder was not in front where I had always kept it. It was in the drawer, but it had been moved, slid behind 2 other folders, as if replaced by someone who had not known the original order. I stood in my socks on the office floor and opened it with a vague, still manageable unease, telling myself I was looking for the insurance renewal, telling myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I flipped through the pages. The insurance was there. The utility bills were there. The home inspection from 4 years ago was there. And then, beneath those familiar papers, there was a document I had never seen before. It was a deed transfer form. A legal instrument transferring title of the property at Merriweather Lane, my mother's house, my house, the house with the oak tree and the electrical tape on the linoleum and the stair I had stepped over as a teenager, from my sole name into the joint names of Mark Allen Whitmore and Eleanor Grace Whitmore. The notarization stamp was dated October 19th. I'd been on the 4th floor of St. Crispin's Medical Center on October 19th with a fever of 102 and an IV drip running morphine into my left arm, watching the ceiling tiles shift in the light. At the bottom of the document, in the space marked transferring owner, was my signature, or something that wore my signature like a costume. The same slant of the C in Clara, the same looping tail of the final letter, close enough that for 3 full seconds I stood there and genuinely tried to remember whether I had, somehow, in the blur of those 9 days, signed something without understanding what it was. The 3 seconds ended. I understood that I had not. My hands were perfectly still. I noticed this with a strange, floating clarity, that my hands were not shaking at all, that they held the document with a steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the particular stillness that arrives when a shock is large enough to suspend all ordinary physical response. The coffee smell drifted from the kitchen downstairs. The oak tree dropped an acorn onto the roof above me, and then another, that slow, familiar percussion I had heard all my life, the sound that had always meant home, and I sat down on the floor of the home office very carefully, still holding the paper, and I read it again from the beginning, Every word, every date, every signature, every line. And then I sat in the cold November light, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. And inside me, something that had been a marriage and a family and a home was rearranging itself into something I did not yet have a name for, but was already learning the shape of. I sat on that floor for a long time, long enough for the light in the window to shift from amber to gray, for the coffee smell downstairs to fade, for the house to settle into the particular quiet of early evening. At some point, I heard Mark's car in the driveway. I heard the front door. I heard his footsteps in the kitchen below me, the familiar sound of him opening the refrigerator, the small domestic percussion of a man who believes himself safe in his own life. I did not call down to him. I folded the document carefully along its existing crease and placed it back inside the pale green folder, exactly as I had found it, and I stood up from the floor and walked to the window and stood there until I heard him call my name up the stairs. "Clara? You up there?" And I answered that I was fine, just resting, and he said, "Okay, dinner in an hour," and I said, "Okay." And then I stood at the window and looked at the bare oak tree in the backyard, and I thought very clearly, for the first time in my life, I need to think before I speak. I cannot do what I want to do right now. I need to be careful. I called Jess from the bathroom with the water running. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, and I told her in a low, level voice what I had found, reading the key details from the document I had carried upstairs, tucked against my chest like contraband. There was a silence on her end, a silence that had its own specific texture, the silence of someone absorbing something that defies their first instinct to say that can't be right. Then she said, "Don't touch anything else in that office. Don't say a word to Mark tonight. And tomorrow morning, first thing, you call David Ung." David Ung was a real estate attorney, her colleague's husband, someone she had mentioned in passing twice over the years and whose name I had never thought I would need. "Clara," Jess said very quietly, "are you all right?" I looked at my own face in the mirror above the sink, at the color that had left it, at the steadiness in my eyes that surprised me. "I don't know yet," I said. "I will be." I sat through dinner that evening with a performance of ordinary life that required every reserve of self-control I possessed. Mark made pasta, the simple weeknight kind, spaghetti with a jar sauce he had added sausage to, a meal I had always found comfortable and unremarkable. We sat across the table from each other in the kitchen where he and his mother had been sitting when I was in the hospital on October 19th, and I ate, and I asked him about his day, and he told me, and I nodded, and I watched his face with an attention I had never turned on it before, looking not for warmth, but for architecture. The way his eyes moved when he talked, the way he smiled and where the smile stopped. He seemed, on the surface, entirely himself, relaxed, easy, occasionally funny, passing the Parmesan without being asked. But there was something underneath the ease that I had been too close to see before, a faint watchfulness, a slight tendency to keep the conversation moving, to fill silences quickly, as if silence might give either of us time to arrive somewhere he preferred we didn't go. After dinner, he said Eleanor had called. She wanted to know how I was feeling. I said I was feeling better every day. He nodded and loaded the dishwasher, and that was the end of it, and I went to bed and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. I called David Ung at 8 the next morning from my car, parked 2 streets away from the house, engine off, the November cold seeping through the windows. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 3 questions: whether I had the document, whether I had a copy of the original deed showing sole ownership, and whether I had any medical records from the date of the alleged signature. I said yes to all three. He said, "Come in this afternoon. Photograph the document, every page, but don't remove it from the house." His voice had a calm, precise quality that I found steadying in a way I had not expected from a stranger. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said before he hung up, "signatures obtained from patients under sedation or narcotic pain management are among the most straightforwardly voidable documents in property law. If the date holds and your hospital records confirm your medication status, what you have found is not just evidence of forgery, it's evidence of fraud." The words sat in the cold air of the car after I ended the call. Fraud. I looked out through the windshield at the empty residential street, at a neighbor's cat walking the top of a garden wall with indifferent precision, and I thought about Eleanor sitting at the foot of my hospital bed, asking me where I kept my important papers, and the cold inside the car felt warm compared to the cold that moved through me then. I photographed the document that afternoon while Mark was at work. 12 photographs from different angles, the signature page twice. Then I replaced it exactly where I had found it and drove to David Ung's office, a low brick building on Sansom Street, with a waiting room that smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner and the kind of institutional calm that only lawyers manage to maintain. He examined the photographs carefully and said nothing for a full 2 minutes. Then he removed his glasses and looked at me. "There's a notarization stamp. You need to find out who the notary is. That person either witnessed a signature they knew to be forged, or they were shown a signature obtained under circumstances that made it legally invalid. Either way, they have exposure." He paused. "Has anyone attempted to record this transfer with the county?" I said I didn't know. He turned to his computer and typed for 90 seconds, and then he made a sound, low, careful, the sound of a man confirming something he had hoped not to confirm. "It was filed," he said, 2 weeks ago. The transfer was recorded on November 4th. I had been home for 2 weeks on November 4th. I had been walking slow loops around the backyard and letting Eleanor bring casseroles and telling myself, later, when I am stronger. I drove home with David Ung's card in my jacket pocket and a list of next steps written in his precise hand on a yellow legal pad, and I sat in the driveway for a moment and looked at the house. My mother's house. My house. The house with the oak tree and the stair I had stepped over as a teenager. And I thought about the fact that 2 weeks ago, while I had been resting inside it, still fragile, still grateful, its ownership had been quietly changed in a county records office, and neither Mark nor Eleanor had said a single word. I thought about the sunflowers at the nurse's station. I thought about the casseroles. I thought about, "We're rooting for you." Mom posted on Facebook for 47 people to like. I got out of the car and went inside. I waited until after dinner. Mark was on the sofa with the television on, a football game, the volume low, and I came and sat in the armchair across from him, and I said his name, and something in the way I said it made him look up immediately. I had the printed photographs of the document on my lap, face down. I turned them over and set them on the coffee table between us, and I watched his face. The shift was immediate. Not surprise, not confusion, but a rapid and unmistakable recalculation, a split second of exposure before he reassembled his expression into something more neutral. That split second was all I needed. It told me everything the document had already told me, and more. "Clara," he said. "I found it," I said, "in the green folder where she put it back." He looked at the photographs. He looked at the table. He looked at the muted television. He did not look at me. "It's not what it looks like," he said, And even as the words came out of his mouth, I watched something in him register how inadequate they were, how they landed in the room between us and simply sat there, small and hollow. "Then tell me what it is," I said. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a document transferring my mother's house into your mother's name, signed with my signature on a day when I was on intravenous morphine with a fever of 102. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the game went to a commercial. He rubbed the back of his neck. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, and what came out was not a denial. What came out was, "She said it was just for legal protection, in case something happened to you. She said if you weren't on the deed with me, the house would be complicated." I felt the words arrive with a strange, dissociated clarity, the way you hear things when you have already, somewhere beneath consciousness, prepared yourself for them. "She said," I repeated, "you knew about this." He looked up briefly, then back down. "Mark." I said it quietly, the way you say something when there is no room left for uncertainty. "You were there. You called the ward. Nurse Diane told me. 2 people called on the same number, asking if I could sign papers. You were there when she got the notary. You watched her do this." His jaw worked once. He said very quietly, "She's my mother, Clara." I looked at him for a long time. "And this was my mother's house," I said. What followed was 3 days of the most specific and brutal kind of clarity. The clarity of a woman who has stopped waiting for things to be other than they are. Mark moved into the guest room without discussion. I spent those days on the phone with David Ing, gathering documents. The original deed from when my mother first purchased the property, my hospital admission records, and the medication logs from the 4 days following surgery, which showed continuous opioid pain management from October 16th through October 20th. David Ung contacted the notary listed on the forged transfer, a man named Robert Chow with a small practice in the financial district, who, when confronted with the hospital records and the date discrepancy, turned the color of old chalk and said he had been told by Eleanor Whitmore that the signature had been obtained with the patient's full awareness and consent, that the patient had been informed beforehand and had agreed. He said she had presented him with what appeared to be a consent letter. He said he had not verified it independently. He said he was very sorry. His being sorry did not change what he had stamped and witnessed, and David Ung made certain he understood this. The 4th day, Eleanor came with a casserole. She knocked on the front door at 11 in the morning, holding the dish with both hands, wearing her dusty pink coat and her silver bob and that small, efficient smile. And I opened the door and looked at her and felt nothing that was warm. "I thought you could use something comforting," she said, tilting her head at that assessing angle, and her eyes moved past me into the house the way they always did, taking inventory. "Come in," I said. I set the casserole on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table, and she moved to sit across from me and stopped. Because on the table in front of her chair, I had laid out the photographs of the deed transfer, the hospital medication log, David Ung's preliminary legal assessment, and a printed copy of the county recording showing the transfer filed on November 4th. She stood at the edge of the table and looked down at the papers, and the small smile did not change. "Clara," she said very gently, as if I were someone who needed gentleness. "I can explain all of this." "I know you think you can," I said. "Sit down." What she offered, sitting across from me with her hands folded with their characteristic stillness, was a revised version of the truth, the version where everything she had done was love, practical love, the love of a mother who had watched her son marry a woman who kept property in her own name and had been afraid, legitimately afraid, of what might happen to him if something went wrong. She said the word protect 4 times in the first 2 minutes. She said family 3 times. She said, "I only ever wanted what was best for everyone," in a voice that had a faint, practiced tremor in it. And I let her speak, and when she finished, I said, "You had a notary stamp a document with a forged signature while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, and then you filed it with the county while you were bringing me casseroles and asking how I was feeling." The practiced tremor arrived in her eyes then, the glassiness that preceded tears, and she said, "You're being very unfair." I looked at her steadily. "My attorney has already filed to void the transfer on the grounds of fraud and lack of legal capacity," I said. "The notary has made a statement. Mark has confirmed his involvement. I am telling you this now as a courtesy, because you are about to receive paperwork that will not feel courteous at all." She looked at the documents on the table. The tremor stopped. Beneath it, in the absence of the performance, her face was simply calculating. The same face, I understood, that had been looking at me for 6 years, always calculating, always measuring what I had against what she wanted. She stood, collected her handbag from the back of the chair. At the door she turned and said, "I did what any mother would do." "No," I said. "You did what you thought you could get away with. There's a difference." David Ung filed the petition to void the fraudulent transfer the following Monday. The county recorded the reversal 8 weeks later, and the deed of Meriwether Lane returned to its single, original name, mine alone as it had always been. On a Tuesday afternoon in late January, when the sky was the pale, clean blue of early winter, and the oak tree's branches were just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of new growth at their tips. The notary, Robert Chow, surrendered his commission and faced a civil complaint from the state. Eleanor received a formal cease and desist and a letter from David Eng that enumerated with considerable legal precision every action she had taken and the consequences she would face if she attempted anything similar. She did not respond. Mark and I had a series of conversations that were honest in a way our conversations had rarely been. Stripped of performance, stripped of the ongoing negotiation that I could see now had characterized our marriage for years. And at the end of them, we both understood, with a sadness that was clean and final rather than ragged, that we were not going to be able to rebuild what had been there. He moved out in February. He did not contest the terms. He was, in the end, a man who had chosen his mother's plan over his wife's safety in a hospital bed, and both of us had to live with what that meant. There is a morning in March that I return to, when I try to understand what the 9 days in the hospital and the 30 days after them actually gave me, beyond the obvious and terrible things they took. It is early, not yet 7, and the kitchen is full of the smell of the coffee I have just made, the good kind, the kind I buy only for myself now, and the light through the kitchen window is the particular soft gold of early spring. Outside, the oak tree is loud with birds, its branches filling back in with green. I take my coffee to the wraparound porch and I sit in the old wooden chair with the peeling blue paint that my mother found at a yard sale in 2004 and that I have never once considered replacing. And I put my feet up on the railing and I hold the warm cup with both hands and I listen to the birds and the distant sound of the street waking up. I think about everything I know now that I did not know before. I know that the people who say they are rooting for you are not always the same as the people who are. I know that what looks like care can be an inventory, and what sounds like love can be a plan. I know that my own name, alone on a deed, was never a problem to be solved. It was the truth of what was mine, and the truth of what was mine was worth every cold January morning on the phone with a lawyer, every dinner eaten in careful silence across a table from a man I was already losing. My mother bought this house in 1998 and spent every warm weekend on this porch with her geraniums and her salvaged furniture, and she left it to me alone, with a simplicity that I understand now as its own kind of wisdom. I sit here in the early spring light, and I drink my coffee and I listen to the oak tree, and the house around me is quiet and entirely, irreversibly mine.